Hi everyone, good morning. Thanks for joining us for the talk. I just wanted to start off by introducing both the artists again, and I'll just be sharing their bios first. So with me today is both Aki and Kai. So let me introduce Aki first. Aki Hassan is a multidisciplinary artist. They use drawing and self-publishing to dissect the non-binary identity and practices of self-care. This informs and develops into installations of welded and casted objects. They see the process of making as a tool to reflect on support systems, to locate strength, shifts, and imbalances in exchange. And with me today also is Kai. So let me just introduce Kai as well. Khairullah Rahim is a multimedia artist working across art objects, assemblage, photography, and video. Through critical thinking centered around the politics of demeanor and the intersections between conspicuity, illegibility, and safety, his research and practice bring to light the veiled narratives and lived experiences of those whose identities may not align with social norms. So both Aki and Khairullah's works are on view in the exhibitions An Exercise of Meaning in a Glitch Season and Time Passes, both of which are at the National Gallery, Singapore. So to start off this conversation today, I wanted to actually check in with both of you on how things are going, how you both are doing. So as you know, both of the exhibitions An Exercise of Meaning in a Glitch Season and Time Passes, they actually opened in September last year. And I think at least for myself, it's like the first time I've been part of an exhibition that's open for at least like half a year. And so this duration is always something that's quite surprising for me as someone who's very accustomed to working in quick flashes. So I think that in the span of the months that the exhibition has been up, you know, it's enough for things to sort of settle or even become unsettled. So I guess the first thing that I wanted to ask was, how are you both doing? You know, how has time passed? Yeah.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, I've been good. I think when the exhibition started, that was when I first started processing, just returning back to Singapore from Glasgow. And I think that the work has kind of grown with me. Like since then, I've been in multiple shows, and I had a solo show at Islands. And I think just being able to ground myself back in Singapore as an artist is very important. So yeah, I feel good and in between celebration, but also not knowing what the future holds. Yeah.
Home, more than even before the COVID period.
Yeah.
So when I remember during when the circuit breaker just started, it was just during the period where my solo exhibition just started. And since then, of course, we had this exhibition, and I've also started enrolling in my MFA program, which I'm doing right now. So I'm currently on my school break, but school will start in 2 weeks' time. I'm having mixed feelings about that one.
Yeah.
But aside from that, yes, like to answer the question, I've been spending a lot of time at home, because home is also where my studio is currently right now. So I have a studio space, but since the circuit breaker, I've sort of like used less of the studio space to work, and I have pretty much made everything from home, even the work that's presented at the National Gallery right now. Yeah.
I guess with the way that Kai ended, it kind of brings us nicely into introducing both works and getting you both to share a bit about the works. But I think before that, just for, I guess, the sake of the viewers, I just wanted to maybe like do a little preamble to introduce both works again. So I want to talk more about the works that are currently on view. For Aki, it's Weighed Down by an Uplift, and for Kai, it's Rendezvous. So I think even in the title, which alludes to this opposing forces, Aki's work Weighed Down by an Uplift actually draws parallels between making work and this kind of supportive structures and relationships. So I think in the accompanying video, there's actually a kind of reflection on the physical making of the work and how that is preceded by digital renderings and other kind of preparatory work. So I think this consideration of like the physical object and the digital rendering also kind of recalls like this pivot towards digital formats brought about by the pandemic. And with Kai's Rendezvous, it continues to speak to the significance of public spaces, such as parks or beaches. And I think that this is a realization that so many of us have, thought about or have surfaced actually during the circuit breaker period. So I think Kai's work actually considers how public spaces have also been a very vital resource before and even so now, that opens up possibilities of interaction and pleasure. And I think that in pairing you both up and in speaking both of you, I think that there are a lot of affinities between both of your practice, and that there is this sort of shared commitment in looking at how to hold and recognize space for becoming or being. And so both works on view right now are also made during the pandemic, and they are also colored specifically by the conditions of the pandemic. So I guess, after my little preamble, I wanted you both to sort of introduce the work, maybe by way of processes, like how was it like making work in a pandemic, and also with like the very tight production timeline that we had for both exhibitions. Yeah.
Okay. I think for this show, it wasn't really like a new work per se, because I see it rather as a new iteration of something which I did recently for the Singapore Biennial, where I presented intimate apparitions, the works which spoke about how different communities or other overlooked communities occupy spaces during very specific time. When I was presented with this opportunity, I see it as a chance for me to revisit a section of those works. It is definitely like a different working experience. The approach is definitely something new for me. Like I said earlier on, the studio space is no longer like a working studio, right? The works were made from home. It was also a period where I feel that a lot of us artists, when we make works, we have to be even more resourceful, because of constraints in terms of space, and also like resources. So space-wise, is already quite challenging because I'm making work at home. With the presence of like all these people who has never probably seen me making works before, and it's their first time. I mean, when I mentioned I'm referring to my family members. They probably have not seen me making works before. So now, I mean, it's not a choice, but it's something that I sort of like have to go along with it. In terms of resources, yes, it's challenging because art shops are closed, right? But also, to be really frank, like my works has always used objects outside of conventional means, like within, say, artist materials. So I don't really shop at, say, Art Friend a lot, right? Because I don't paint and all those things. So luckily, essential shops like hardware shops are open for me. So I could get hold of some of those materials. What else? I mean, time is also not on our on our side. I remember when you asked me if I want to do something, I knew that I did not really want to make something completely new. But at the same time, I'm also thankful because like I feel like I have. I mean, this idea is not something which just sparked during the pandemic, because a lot of these discussions and a lot of this research has already been ongoing months or even years before the pandemic. So I rather see it as an opportunity for me to make something rather than baking cakes or I don't know like what everyone else was doing.
Aki, what about yourself?
Sorry, what was the question?
I think it's maybe to find out a little bit more about your process of making the work and how that has been colored during the pandemic, or how the pandemic has changed those situations. I think Kai brought up an interesting point about space, which we talked about also quite a fair bit earlier.
I think when I was making my work with Down by an Uplift, it was more so the starting point was to make a commentary on this immediate response by the art worlds towards digitalization, as almost like its own form of survival. Like for art to be relevant, it needs to
Yeah.
be digital. And I
Yeah.
think as a sculptor, after graduating from a sculpture course, it was kind of confusing to place myself in that position where work had to be in that form and in that material. And I think because the digital format is so I feel so alienated by it, and it's so far away from my practice. I needed to ground myself in something that I was comfortable while doing something I was uncomfortable with.
Yeah.
And I think throughout the process, I was really like supported by Shahida. We were like constantly in conversation about the video, because I was honestly struggling with the video rendering. I think like because I see video as a material rather than like a form, or like I see, like I needed to treat the digital space as this material to kind of work around.
Yeah.
So Shahida was like, you are new to this, you are new to, you know, the digital format, so why must it be successful? So I think like we made room for failures to happen, and I think that was a very important like starting point for me to even think about the digital space and how my work would exist in that. So in terms of making like the sculpture with the balloons, that was kind of like in response to the video, and it was like a process that I was so familiar with already. But the only problem was that I had to find space to do it. I had to find people that could offer me spaces to make my work. And because I was unfamiliar with where to reach out to and who to reach out to, because I just came back to Singapore, you know. So it was just like a process of just reaching out to many different people, like finding out where to find all these materials, and it just happened within 4 to 6 weeks of just like we have to get this done.
I mean, I think definitely the timeline really pushed us into a certain kind of urgency, which I definitely would not want to condone. But it's also the fact that work like this, or being able to work like this, is only possible because we have the support of other people that are holding us, you know, as we are going through this process. So it's almost like for every work that comes, there's like this whole other family behind it that might not be entirely visible when the work is on display. And so I think with that, I wanted to continue asking more about your work, and maybe riffing off what you mentioned about this idea of like working with something that you're comfortable with, but also working with something that you're uncomfortable with. So I think that for both of your work, there's a lot of attention to the material, and specifically how the material is like being stylized, or it's being represented, or it's being manipulated or worked with, actually speaks to these like gestures of like care or attention. And so I think with Weight Down by an Uplift, I wanted to describe the work a little bit, since we don't have any kind of visual aid here. So I think what we see if you go into the exhibition is that the balloon is actually this sort of stretched taut against the metal structure. But I think even if it's like sort of stretched taut, it's also sort of lovingly held in place and is lovingly buoyed by that structure. And so I think that this material interplay actually visualizes a way of reciprocating, and specifically how do materials accommodate and make concessions for one another. And I think that really ties in nicely to what we were just saying about how, in order to make work, we also have to like, so many people have to sort of work with us to make that work, or so many people have to work with us to figure those processes out. And so I think that with your work, you see how these two materials, they're not just like competing or conflicting with one another, they're actively trying to make space for one another. So like for instance, like, you know, you see how like the metal structure needs to be bent a certain way in order to accommodate the circumference of the balloon. But also for the balloon to be held in place, it has to lose some of its fullness. And I think that kind of reciprocal relationship is really very fruitful. So for me, I wanted to ask you how you maybe choose the mediums that you work with, how do you work with them, and how do you even think about like these material relationships?
I think for me, when I was thinking about a balloon and metal, it was more so thinking about how different types of material could trust one another. So how the balloon was placed,
Yeah.
what needed to be in a way where the balloon needed to almost trust me to put it there.
Yeah.
And there was this very like I feel like I was in conversation with the balloon to like fit in it and just like stay there. And nothing has happened to it for like the past months, you know. Yeah, yeah, but I just feel like in my process, it's always been about finding materials that could have that kind of like trust and like almost playing with trust and figuring out how they could like coexist and be with one another. And because balloon is such like almost a malleable material, and then you have a metal structure that is fixed and almost actually not accommodating at all, because I had to make it beforehand.
Right.
And you know, I had to like send it for powder coating and everything. And the balloon was the one that was like, okay, I could go bigger or smaller and I could play with that. So it was like finding materials that are just very different and are responsive. Could respond to one another differently.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you mentioned like the metals actually like really fixed and like unyielding, because I think that like when we sort of see your work, the way that it bends, the way that it's like looking after the balloon, like you wouldn't be able to tell that like it's the balloon that actually has to like, you know, be the one that responds to that relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think extending from this subject of like responsiveness towards materials and mediums, I also wanted to bring the question back to Kai and his work. So I think that like with Aki's work, I feel like with Kai's work, there's also this fruitful tensions between the materials negotiating with one another, or the what they express or what they shouldn't be expressing. And I wanted to think about this tension in relation to your work, Rendezvous. So with Rendezvous, it's an assemblage of various objects, most of them that is housed within this sort of aquarium structure. And there is, I think, a very stark play in visibility in that what you have with the installation, what you have with the assemblage is that the see-through glass of the aquarium structure actually renders everything very starkly visible. And even I think the embellished plants and like the shower roses actually focuses our gaze, and they heighten that sense of visibility of the objects. But for some reason, I think the objects also remain very curiously coded or disguised. And I think in some sense, it's kind of like they're hidden in plain sight. So I think what I wanted to ask or have you share a little bit more about was this approach of, I think, like strategic visibility in terms of like your materials and how you approach your materials.
Visibility is something that I've been thinking a lot in my works, or rather my practice over the years. When I think about visibility, I also think about legibility, and I'm thinking also about the audience, because when I make works, eventually when they are presented outside, right, I understand that the audience will probably have multiple ways of like perceiving artwork. So like number one, I've always, I mean, maybe recently more than in the past, I've realized that I need to understand the term audience as something which is quite pluralistic and not singular. So ideally for me now, in my works, I would like to think of how my work could have various access points to different layers of audiences. For instance, if you are interested in, say, the beauty of the work, by all means, go and appreciate the beauty, hopefully. But if you are, say, coming from a point where you have knowledge or understanding about what are some of these coded objects, right? I like to think about like how these objects could also, or rather how these aspects of the work could be like only accessible to you, right? Because I don't feel the work should be accessible to everyone in the same manner, right? Because again, when we talk about visibility is something that people need to realize. All of us have very different relationship with that. While most of us think about visibility as a kind of like a safety measure, or like a point of safety, but we also need to realize that for some communities, being visible is actually something that put them at risk in the country, especially like Singapore. So legibility or rather illegibility is something that I've been thinking about, and I've been trying to like come to terms with recently with the work. In the past, I used to think that, oh, what if people don't get it, right? What if does it defeat the purpose of the work? Then now I think no, like I think it's okay. It's okay for different people to take very different takeaway points from looking at the work, because again, I think. Visibility, conspicuity, and safety are quite closely intertwined. And as an artist, I would like to be more responsible in manners of how I show the work, I speak about the works.
Yeah, I think something that comes up a lot in like our past conversations also, you also mentioned about like I think instead of using the word visibility, you often use the word like opacity. And I think opacity becomes like that kind of strategy to be thinking about these ranges of visibility that might suit or that has to be adaptive, you know, because different circumstances call for different kind of strategies. And so I feel like even in the title of the work, you know, it's like everything is very obvious, but like it is a rendezvous. So there is like some things that will not be accessible because they're not meant to be accessible. They're not meant to be easily accessible in a sense. It's not in some sense that you are meant to be closing off people, but it's for the safety of like certain kind of like lived experiences.
Like maybe perhaps opacity as a kind of like protection or like shield from like various lenses. That I am very clear about like who do I want these works to reach out to, or who do I not want to have access to the works, you know. So I think it's like, so also I also think about camouflage, you know. Some people when we think about camouflage, it's always like showing less, you know, but I use like the complete opposite, which is like I'm gonna show more to like hide like some of these not hidden meanings, but just maybe different meanings for different specific groups of people that I would like to protect in those works.
And I think that across both of your works there's really this sort of attention towards like your materials, in the sense that you feel like a lot of responsibility towards how they are portrayed or how they are handled, and how during the process they come to speak. It's like they're slowly learning how to articulate like certain things. And so I guess the next question that I wanted to ask was also something that I've had in mind a really long time already when I was thinking about both of your works, is this question of like feelings. And so I guess the reason why I wanted to talk about feelings was to go back, I guess, to the fact that so much of the subject matters that both of you work with is recurring, and it's something that endures over a certain period of time. And I think that I feel like both of you make art that is grounded in feeling, in that it recognizes, I think, both like the pleasure and the perils of like certain ranges of lived experiences. And also in our conversations, we know that a lot of feelings are actually poured into the objects that you both make. So I guess I wanted to bring in a reference here, in that Audre Lorde actually had an essay that was called Poetry is Not a Luxury. So she actually speaks about how poetry is a vital and necessary means for survival and strength. And so she specifically highlights paying attention to our feelings as the engine not only for creation but also for what allows us to keep going on. And I would like to share an excerpt of what Audre Lorde wrote. So it goes like, our feelings and the honest exploration of them become sanctuaries and fortresses and spawning grounds for the most radical and daring of ideas. The house of difference, so necessary to change in the conceptualization of any meaningful action. For within structures defined by profit, by linear power, and by institutional dehumanization, our feelings are not meant to survive. And I think that for Audre Lorde, it is poetry, and I think likewise for us, we can also apply that to think about art practice as what gives us the strength and courage to see, to feel, to speak, to dare, to relate. And I know that we are sort of going into like in like a spiral because like I have such a long preamble, but I think it's also because like sometimes talking about feelings always feel like like pigeonholing an artist in terms of like reading their work solely along the lines of their biography. But I think that for this conversation, I wanted to spend some time talking about how these feelings are like messy, but they're also kind of fruitful and productive in a different way. Or the process of making art becomes a way of clarifying some of these feelings. And it's kind of like what Audre Lorde wrote about, the honest exploration of feelings. So yeah, I wanted to, throw the question to you both about, this subject of feelings and how they inform your work or how you work through them with your work. Yeah.
I think when it comes to feelings, as an artist, I always felt that there's this scrutiny when you feel too much or you expose that you are able to feel.
Right.
So a lot of the feelings I feel are held by the work, and it's so loudly spoken about through, whether it's through the material, through the title, through all these different things. To be blunt, like I think the title "Weighed Down by an Uplift" came from that experience of having to feel uplifted by being given an opportunity, but this weight of having to like move within the opportunity, take it as like it's a point of privilege, but also knowing that it was like an urgent work to be done. I think I feel like through art, a lot of your feelings becomes encapsulated almost.
Yeah.
It's like, again, I think like that whole idea of like protection and shielding and knowing when things are visible, like is important.
It's like you're saying something, but you're saying it in like an almost like detouring way, so that it's not immediately like recognizable, because that's also a way of like protection. You don't want to be you don't want yourself to be rendered explicit, and sometimes we don't feel comfortable with that either. So it's almost like letting the art speak the feelings on your behalf.
And also like I feel like when you're too honest about your feelings, you're almost like discounted for doing so. And so I feel that like art making becomes a very important process for me to figure out when things should be like available, whether things should be accessible, and I think that's that.
Yeah, in some ways it's like a way of speaking, and I guess like, and I mean obviously they're like, oh yeah, art is an expressive medium, but I think it's like a way of speaking that isn't so much like I'm writing a diary entry, but it's saying something out without necessarily putting yourself out there in the spotlight. There is again that play of visibility and how much is said and how much should be said, but like veiled,
For sure.
And I really also enjoy, I guess, the emphasis that we sort of go back onto titles, because I've always been someone who, one of the few starting points that I like to start with work is like the title, because I think titles come mostly sometimes at the end of the work or at the start of the work, and with Weighed Down by an Uplift, I guess if we can use the phrase to talk about the entire experience of sort of working on things like that, it's always like we have to acknowledge the sheer privilege of being able to be given such space, such money, and in some sense such institutional support to present the work that we do. But also with that, there are like so many other kind of different concessions that we have to negotiate. There's also so many other responsibilities that we have to attend to, and I think that there is like both like the being weighed down by it, but also recognizing that it is like an uplift. It is like something that still has something to offer. Actually Kai, I mean we sort of like went about there, but I realized to bring it back to you about feelings, and it's funny because I think over time, I think because Kai and I managed to work on a couple of shows together, we got closer, and we always be like, we're the feeling squad, but we never declare that outright. So that actually goes to say that we are actually a little bit embarrassed by being very feelings oriented.
Explicitly.
Low key, very low key.
Low key?
So low key.
I think personally for me, like it's very difficult to separate feelings, and say my practice, which obviously stems from a lot of lived experiences, right? It's very easy. I think like what Aki mentioned. There's also this thing about how feelings get discounted when it's overtly shared. It gets watered down. People don't take it seriously. People
but it's also about like whose feelings are like attended to and cared for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So like Oh my god. Okay. Yeah, but I think I also think, you know, sometimes where things start as seemingly it may look like it's a very introspective thing, right? Oh, this is
Yeah.
my feelings and
Yeah.
this is me. But sometimes you realize that for me at least, like when I make works, you realize that at some point in the art making process, the work becomes more and more distant from the personal, right?
Yeah.
You could actually be addressing very big and no, not big, but very real pressing issues, and then you realize that actually this is not just about me.
Yeah,
You know,
it
then
goes
you,
beyond
you think about actually what usually stems from a very introspective kind of like source could also be something that people have always been wanting to talk about. You know, during the pandemic, there's all these issues and prejudice and inequalities that has been reported, and I don't know why people are pretending as though they are so surprised by all these things, right? But all these things have been happening way before during the pandemic. So now I think it's great that with opportunities like this, right, we get to discuss issues that has always been very important to talk about. Yeah, but I don't really see it as kind of like a show to like in response to COVID or recent times.
Yeah.
These are actually issues that has been around. People have been wanting to talk about for the longest time.
Yeah.
So I think it's quite great thinking that like to think that something like that could come from like being comfortable with feelings in the first place and expressing those things out.
Yeah, I think that I guess for me, when I was just thinking about working on a show and the responsibilities involved in working in the show, I think that one of the greatest privilege is being able to be given some thread of continuity from whatever that we were working on before, thinking about before, talking about before, and given the chance to continue on talking about it. So in a lot of sense, I feel like in both exhibitions, Glitch Season and Time Passes, it's not like just a pandemic show. It's definitely conceived during the pandemic, and so the circumstances of the pandemic will affect the production and like the processes of the show. But so many of these are feelings and ideas and inquiries that have been long undertaken even before the pandemic has come up. And I think that with this, I wanted to go on to one of my last few questions, and it's something to do with vulnerability, and it's something that I've raised up to you both. And I think that it's a nice segue because we were sort of talking about being open with feelings, but also the whole process of having to be very exposed and out there. And I think that sense of being exposed and being opened up to is really, I think, the most essential definition or the most generic definition of vulnerability. And I think it's something that we must contend with, especially in the pandemic, knowing that different people have very different levels of difficulty in living through it. So I guess to bring it back to vulnerability, I wanted to talk about it because when we think about vulnerability, it's really a condition of openness that speaks to how we are hurt or affected by something, but it also talks about us affecting something or hurting something or being able to open up to something. So in some sense, I think that while I was thinking a lot about vulnerability and speaking to several people about it, I was really interested in that sense of like reciprocalness or reciprocity between this social relation. And I think that because vulnerability is a condition of openness, speaks to how, you know, you can be affected by something, but you can also be affected. It's really this very foundation of how we relate to one another, how we can care and are cared for, and how we hurt and, you know, how we are hurt, but we are also capable of delivering hurt. And so I think that this reciprocal relationship is something that I've brought up just now. I think it's something that I feel emanates really strongly in both of your works. And so another way, I guess, to talk about it very simply is to think about how it's, you know, how can we acknowledge both like pain and hurt and anger, but also at the same time, you know, pleasure, joy, and connection. And so, yeah, I wanted to take some time to maybe ask you both about this aspect of your work both of your works that moved me a lot, which is how do you make work that identifies like this possibility of both like pain, pleasure, but also joy and connection? Yeah.
I think it goes back to what I mentioned earlier on also, like having a pluralistic way of understanding like the work. It could have like a few possible tangents of like being presented, you know. Like for me, personally in my works, I am very aware that as much as it's talking about some of these really issues that are affecting real people, but I used a kind of like a very there's a kind of like a forthcomingness in terms of like my approach and my strategy in the work. I think it's also very, very important for me. There's a kind of like persuasiveness with the work. Like I don't see myself as an activist. I have nothing against activists, but I do not know how to function myself as an activist. So as an artist, personally for me, I always think about how do I reach out to some of my audiences, you know, how do I present to them something which is probably uncomfortable to talk about. You know, don't even say audience, right? Even with my family members, it's very difficult for me to like share with them exactly what the works are about. So I see this is a kind of process for me to also consider thinking about how do I reach out to the audience. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
I think it does
also
in
like,
an extended way.
Right. Because I don't know, like because vulnerability is not like a one definition thing. You know. People also, I mean, just as much as people are not very fond of overt feelings, right? People are also not very fond, or rather, people don't want to see vulnerability. This is what I've learned. You know, as much as we are all for this, I agree. But the reality is, at what cost? You know, for you to be vulnerable, you know, there is also a chance where that support that you seek or you hope, you know, to get
would be weaponized or used against you.
There have been instances where you don't get back that kind of like support after being so vulnerable. So I think especially artists, we have to constantly think about again how vulnerable do we want to like present ourselves as.
I think for me, like in thinking about vulnerability, I would like to just like go back to my process of making. When I make, I reference and think about my relationships with like my friends and my family, and the idea of queer joy and how that can be expressed. And I think in every joyous state, there's also a lot of pain and difficulty behind it. I think about support systems because I think we use the idea of support so openly and so casually, like it's an easy thing to do. But when you're supporting someone, when you're caring for someone, oftentimes that process is so deep and complex and so difficult to discuss. And so I think when I make my work, that kind of like irony of being supported, but also at what cost and in what way, that's important to me. So like in this work, Way Down by an Uplift, I was thinking a lot about suffocation in being cared for, but also wanting to care too much. And I think I see that all the time in different types of support system, whether it's someone who's not marginal, trying to care for marginalized people. Sometimes they want to know too much. Sometimes they want to be that person for that, like the other. And I think that kind of relationship is often difficult to discuss so openly about. Even though, you know, right now there's a lot of questions around visibility, around who is being discriminated, around who is being, who should be lifted up. But we are not talking about the other side of like, how is this sustainable? how is being cared for sustainable.
Yeah, the work that goes into being vulnerable, but
Yeah.
also, you know, when you mention about the work of like someone else pouring or like channeling their like very overt care and attention onto you, it comes with like very warm, nice intentions, but it also feels a little bit parasitic. Maybe not even a little bit, very parasitic. Yeah.
I think it's that it's when people expect themselves to know more about you than you know yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's just like, when?
Yeah, and that you are in some sense obligated to offer that part of yourself to them.
Yeah.
And so I think that process of care and I think of vulnerability is like they're both very intertwined. And so I think care is something that I think about a lot, because I think before that for me it was always about like, how is care a very mutual relationship. But sometimes when we use words like mutual, it really implies that I give 50% and I get back 50%. But it's not always like such clean, neat numbers on math. It's very difficult, and it's also very effusive, like the kind of dynamics that go into caring. And so something that came up a lot when I was working on a show and thinking about the work of care and the work of caretaking is that we sometimes have to acknowledge that like we cannot care and that we are not able to always care. Like care isn't like a ceaseless kind of unending gesture that we are able to give continuously, because there is like this limit to our energy and our resources. And then maybe there are people who have more energy and more resources to be able to care more freely. But also that, you know, sometimes it's like when someone offers that care for you, how do you not reciprocate if you don't want to, you know? And sometimes we don't necessarily want to be in a reciprocal interaction because that demands so much from us. And it's I think this is always hard for me to admit, because it's like I'm someone who's really interested in like this idea of reciprocity, and like it's not just like in friendships or in love, but then there are also times when we have to realize that reciprocity is not warranted and it's not necessary, and in fact puts a lot of stress and pressure onto another person. Yeah, and this is just a really long this is a very, very long like roundabout way of saying like find boundaries. Yeah, and like, you know, find boundaries. So I mean, more or less I think we've sort of channeled through a few of the questions that I wanted to ask both of you already, and unless you both have questions that you want to ask each other. If not, I want to go on to actually the last question to sort of wrap things up, and that is really to maybe take a note of like the whole idea of like uplift, you know, like since we talked a lot about also what weighed us down and the difficulties, I wanted to bring it back to present time and thinking about, you know, so many of the times like the work that we do in the field that we are working in requires us to be fast, efficient, productive. But we also are struggling with the realization that it takes a lot of time to realize something or to understand something or to even be able to articulate it in a very consolidated, coherent form. So rather than asking like, what's next, or if you want to answer that, you can also say what's next. But I guess I'm curious about, in this time and obviously in the cusp of the new year, what has been nourishing you, or what have you found like joy in? Yeah.
I think I have a very simple answer to that. Like I don't really think deeply about that question, to be honest. Like I think doing my masters right now, despite what everyone is saying, like how could you be doing like a fine arts MFA on Zoom? How is it even possible? I actually find a lot of joy and comfort in doing my MFA now. I think that is one of the strange coping mechanism that I'm going through right now. So a lot of readings, a lot of like listening, you know, hearing people speak about artworks or even their practices outside of Singapore. I think it's something which is very nourishing for me. I think it's also something which is very much needed for me personally.
That happens at a very different pace also from the pace of making, right?
Yeah.
And
at night
producing.
also, because of the time difference.
Different time zones also, on top of pace. Aki, yes.
I think for me, it's more about recognizing that the next hour is also the future. I think that's what the pandemic genuinely taught me, not to look too far ahead, but also look forward to the next minute or the next few hours, and just settling in that.
Yeah, that continual space rather than like, oh, 5 years, oh, next month. Like, I think it's just about tomorrow, and then
Yeah.
the tomorrow, and then the tomorrow, and then that sort of opens up the space for us to think about a future, and then to maybe realize it even. Yeah, I think that we can sort of end off here. So let me just sort of thank everyone for spending your morning and, well, I think now soon to be afternoon with us. And please also tune in for the last artist talk in February. That will also be live on this channel. And both exhibitions are also still on view until the end of February, which is 21st February. So after this, I think we also appreciate if you can take some time to fill in the feedback form using the QR code that will show on the screen shortly. And thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye.
Is it done?
Thank you.